See you. Thank you.
Right, hello everyone. This is my first big B-Sides talk. My first ever one was on the inaugural B-Sides Newcastle, standing in a skate park half pipe. So it's a little bit different here, being a bit more civilised. But yeah, I'm going to talk to you about possibility of improving the threat modelling process using a free tool. It's something that we've started using in our organisation. And as I played with it, I thought, yeah, there's quite a lot of potential here. So I'm not going to give you something that's finished and polished, but hopefully just put some ideas of something you might want to take and work with if you haven't got the resources for something else. So I'm Andrea Jones. I'm a lead information security product assurance analyst, and I work for a big supermarket. That's our colour, as well as the B-Sides Bristol colour, so Sainsbury's. I've been in information security for about 10 years, fell into it from sitting in an IT department and head of IT coming and say, "You've got an eye for detail, I'll give you our ISO 27001 to do." But having had a kind of history of building computers and playing with databases and websites and all that sort of thing, and starting in the days of DOS, I used to teach word processing on DOS. You might think that's not even possible. I ran a database in DOS as well. So yeah, that kind of background and the knowledge of some of those nuts and bolts, I think, has helped. And I would say it's a kind of a mile wide and an inch deep knowledge, but it helps you in InfoSec because you get so many different things and aspects to look at. So I'm on Twitter if you want to find me. And we do have some vacancies at the moment. We'll probably have a few more coming up. If you're looking for an entry-level position in particular, keep your eye on our site for the next few months. You might find a good opportunity coming up. So what's the problem that we're trying to address here? I don't know if many of you are building in the cloud nowadays. I expect most of you are moving that way if you're not there already. But how many of you look into your cloud security hubs and see this mass of alerts of various issues? Or you look at the security score and perhaps it's around 60% or something. And it's just because people go ahead and build things and they don't really know what they should be doing in the configuration to get that top score. And they don't bother, do they? I don't know if that's a few nods of heads. I'm glad someone else is thinking this is a problem as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is really how you can use this tool to hopefully improve that posture. And that is all part of improving the security posture, isn't it? Because that's where these things come from. So developers, they don't follow the best practice. They don't read the company policy to the letter. Often things get past the people who could tell them what the policy says. So it's often too late, and it's very expensive to sort these things out once you've built the final product, isn't it? And maturity is hard, isn't it? We know that looking at our kids growing up. I always use laundry bins and putting your clothes in them as an example of a maturity model. I think it's a very good likeness. So what's threat modelling? How many of you do threat modelling? Let's have a show of hands. Yeah, we're around, I don't know, maybe the 40% mark, something like that. So I'm glad there's quite a lot of you who don't do it and perhaps don't know what it is. It's a very good thing to do and can be very, very helpful. So it's performed at the design stage, which should be performed at the design stage of the security development lifecycle. Security development lifecycle is something Microsoft have developed, but there's also a design stage on the systems design development life cycle as well. So you start off with your requirements and specification, and then you go through to your design and so on. And obviously if you get to production and you then find out about all these problems, that's where the expense comes in. A few helpful resources for you. The Bible of Threat Modelling, Adam Shostak's book, Threat Modelling, Designing for Security. That's got some particularly helpful appendices in it as well. Very worthwhile investment. There's the OASP pages on threat modelling. They also do some paid training courses. If you really want to get into the subject, then you can go on one of their courses and get a really in-depth instruction on how to do it. And the Torian threat modelling playbook can also be quite helpful. Some resources there that you can use. So we start off in threat modelling with a diagram. Show what there is that we're building. The process then goes on to identifying threats, mitigating the threats, and validation. And often this is represented as a circle, and some threat models, frameworks throw in a fifth element as well. But the whole idea is that you don't stop at the validation because you go back again. So the whole thing is, what are we building? What could go wrong in it? What can we do about the going wrong? It's no good working out what can go wrong if you don't then work out what you're going to do to solve the problem, is it? And then, did we do a good enough job? So if you didn't do a good enough job, if you're not happy with the finished result, you go back to the beginning and you work through again, and you work a little bit deeper next time. So looking at the maturity side of things, this is the OASP Security Assessment Maturity Model. I think it's actually Software Assessment Maturity Model, but it's called SAM. I think someone else mentioned this earlier. And you can see here that threat modelling comes in under the sort of design pillar of this as well. But again, OASP has a lot of resources on threat modelling and maturity as well. So maturity levels, you've probably heard of this sort of thing before, but they're generally graded around your sort of, the thing doesn't exist at all, or you've defined a process, it's there at least, but then it's got to get a little bit more mature, and you've got to get it implemented. And then to get that really polished, to be a real ninja in this thing, then it needs to be consistently applied across the organisation and properly integrated with your processes so that you can't get through those loops. Now, often it's easier to do that by implementing some expensive tool. And yes, there are expensive tools out there that can help you with that, but not everyone has the resources for that, or it takes time to implement them fully throughout the organisation, and you may not be able to implement them in some aspects. And so threat modelling, you can apply it to any systems, and you can apply it to multiple systems from multiple technologies joined together to look at that. And there's the descriptor for level 3 of where you need to get to be in that real sort of ninja state with your threat modelling. And I think the thing, the very last paragraph there about automating parts of the process using threat modelling tools. So, trying to do it all manually with pen and paper, yes, it's possible, but it's not easy to get that ninja consistency doing it that way, because people forget things or they don't realise that this is a different technology and there could be other issues at play here. And all that integration, that learning from mistakes, and then building things back in. Someone was saying earlier on an AI talk about taking stuff from the SOC and how they dealt with tickets and building it into an engine. Well, you can do the same sort of thing with threat modelling. What problems have we had in our organisation with these technologies, and how did we remediate those issues? Build it into your threat modelling so you can tell people, look, this is how you need to build this. So frameworks, there's quite a number around, and you may have come across various ones. But Stride is the one I'm looking at today. It's probably the most mature threat modelling framework, but it does take a fair bit of effort to apply it. There's another one called PASTA, the Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis, obviously very attack-driven. Attack trees, they can be useful in more sort of situations where you don't have quite so much infrastructure, or maybe you're looking with lots of third-party platforms that you're not responsible for, but you can still look at those various issues around authentication and the like. And again, ShowStack's book's got some very good appendices with information about that in there. Something that's been around a long time, security cards, the elevation of privilege card game. Some of you may have looked at that in the past. It's best, you need to apply these things in the context of an actual system. It's no good just getting the cards out and playing a game. You need to actually analyse your system. And again, thinking of the what could go wrong is the bit that is sometimes the hard thing. of having to do that research and find out the possible issues. So looking at STRIDE, the 6 letters stand for different elements of the threat modelling of what we're looking at. So when an attacker is attacking, one thing they can try is spoofing. And so that's pretending to be someone or something other than yourself. And so you counteract spoofing by very good authentication. And that's where we've got to the point of having to implement MFA and things. Obviously, we still get attackers find ways around that. But the whole thing is that if you're going to mitigate spoofing, you need to look at strong authentication and how you do that. Tampering. So that's modifying data in some place. So it could be static or in transit. And so we get around that with integrity, that what is there is what we expect. So taking hashes and things so that we know that what's there is what was there before. And having backups so that you can restore your integrity is obviously another important mitigation. Repudiation. Not me, mate. Attackers, they'll often come in and mess with your logs and try and make it look like they weren't there. They'll take over someone else's account, and so it looks like this person was doing it. And sometimes even just having shared accounts, that gives you repudiation because you don't know who did it, who was using that shared account. And so the property we want there is non-repudiation. We can absolutely nail this down, and we've got all the solid evidence of who was doing what, and nobody can mess with that evidence. Information disclosure. And so that's obviously a lot of what we see. Grabbing stuff. Lisa was talking earlier, ransomware groups steal your data and ransom you for it. But yeah, all sorts of places where information can get leaked out. And so we prevent that happening with confidentiality encryption. But again, a bit of advice on what encryption standard to use could be very useful in your threat modelling process, so your developers put the right sort of encryption in there. And don't get nasty things in their pen test reports of you've got some weak cyber block training protocol in use or something. Denial of service. Well, it's not just bots attacking websites. It's anything that denies access to a resource. And so even deleting a file can be a denial of service because it's no longer available. But obviously you can also get to things around there about any sort of resource exhaustion. One of the nice things in the cloud is having auto-scaling available. So looking at the possibility that this element might come under extreme pressure, can you scale it in some way? Or, with using message queues and things so that systems don't get overloaded with a flood of traffic. And then finally, the E stands for elevation of privilege, doing something you're not allowed to do. And so their authorization is something that we can put in place. So by thinking about those different elements of STRIDE, you can probably see that you can go through and threat model something and think about each of those components and how could that sort of thing happen in this system. And that's the whole idea of STRIDE. So when we diagram threat models, these are the standard symbols that we use. Rectangles for things external to the system. Any sort of process, so executable and any other components is shown in a circle. Data store is 2 parallel lines, and then a data flow with a bendy arrow. And if you want to draw some of these diagrams, OWASP's free Threat Dragon tool is quite nice for drawing the diagrams, and you can use it to manually document your threat modelling process if you like. But it doesn't give you the actual things of what could go wrong, any prompts or anything else. I think this matrix here is quite useful of how the STRIDE elements are likely to apply to these sorts of components, because, when it comes to data stores, spoofing is not the kind of thing that generally happens. You authenticate on your way to the data store, but it's not the data store itself that applies to. And as for repudiation, well, if the data store is logs, yes, repudiation will come into it, but often it's not very relevant. So here's a sample threat modelling diagram done with those standard symbols for the type of thing I'm going to demonstrate in a moment. So I've got something here where a person uploads an image file to an S3 bucket. That goes to an SNS topic into an SQS queue, onto a lambda function, which basically runs some Python, which then might reduce the size of that image to make it suitable for storage or onward processing. And then it goes perhaps off to some other system. So that's just a very simple diagram of the kind of system someone might set up and that you might threat model. And the dotted lines you see there are what we call trust boundaries. So they're the points at which there's a significant change in trust in the systems and where a threat actor might interact with that system. But obviously if someone's inside your system, then they may interact at a lower level, and I think it's still worth considering protecting everything that's inside that trust boundary. So the tool that I'm going to show you, and some of you may come across it, but you might have got frustrated because you found everything was Azure and didn't apply to what you wanted to do. It's Microsoft's threat modelling tool. And so the template it provides, there's one for Azure, there's one for Microsoft's own software development lifecycle, and there's also one for medical devices. And all the templates are basic XML files. So although they have a TB7 extension, you can quite easily open them in a text editor, and you can put your own customizations into them. Although you don't need to do that to create the template, but I find that's useful for kind of naming it and saying what it is and putting some notes about it. So when building your template, you need a few components, and I'm going to particularly major this talk on the AWS side of things because it's a very big cloud platform that's in use a lot everywhere. And unfortunately, there's no template for it in this tool. So AWS provide a PowerPoint presentation with all their icons in. So that's a wonderful resource, and it's free for anyone who's an AWS customer or partner to use. When it comes to looking at what should you do, the mitigations, rather than trying to work it out yourself, it's always best to go to these best practice guides and to look at the pages about certain components and how you should operate them for best practice, and get all the mitigations they list there, the sorts of configurations you should put in place. So the AWS Security Foundational Best Practice is a good list of some of the things. And these are the things that turn up in AWS's Security Hub to give you alerts. So if you can address them, you'll cut down your alerts for a start. There's also a set of benchmarks in there for the CIS benchmarks. But just note with those that there is a license issue around use of the CIS benchmarks for commercial use. MITRE ATT&CK framework, again, that can be a useful source of mitigation advice, and also about kind of defence and monitoring advice. So not everything can always be mitigated very easily. And so you may need to, in your threat modelling, look at, well, have we got suitable detection in place so that if our threat did happen, we can pick it up even if we can't prevent it. Your organisational policies and any security standards and guidelines that you've got, very useful. Build that into a tool like this, and then hopefully you can shift left, hand this to your developers. They can build their architecture, and it can bring out all those components for them so that they know what's applicable in this situation. And very important to put in that information about mitigations. As I said earlier, what's the point of finding all the possible things that could go wrong if you're not going to do anything about it? That's the nub of all this. So here's some example threats from the Foundational Security Best Practice S3.1 and S3.8. So that relates to S3 buckets. So these are related to blocking public access. How many stories do we hear of exposed S3 buckets and the big data breaches that they lead to? So one is relating to blocking it at the account level, and the other one is at the bucket level. And there's 4 properties there of the bucket that need to be set to true for this to be fully mitigated. And what you can do in this tool is you can actually give options for these properties and allow people to select how is yours set. And if they do that, then you can write your threat analysis so that you can work out, the way they've got that set, if they haven't got all 4 set to true, they're at risk of a threat like this. And so here's an example of some threat details entered for that particular threat. So just got a name for the threat at the top, and you see there all the brackets and OR statements around those various properties that have been set there to do the test. And then here is the mitigation. And the threat modelling tool does encode apostrophes and things for you, so you have to live with that. It comes out beautifully in the end. But I like to put in some URLs where people can look up further information and get that advice. You can also put a severity. I use the Foundational Security Best Practice ratings to put the severity there. And you can also enter the stage of the SDLC where that should be implemented. So hopefully I'll be able to show you something of this tool now. I'm not sure what time we are. Right. Yes, we've got plenty of time. Wow. I wasn't sure how rushed I'd have to be on my demo. Right. So here is the tool. So I'm going to start off by opening a template, just so that I can show you some of the nuts and bolts of how this is made. So I've got one that I've made for today. And so here on the left, you see all the kind of standard components that Microsoft has put in, and it does have some generic elements. But it's not always easy to get the full benefit of threat modelling just from a generic element. It will give you some information, but not as detailed as it could be as looking at our S3 bucket, for example. And then we go down and we've got various Azure components, as I was telling you earlier. Here are our trust boundaries. Now you can have a trust boundary either as a rectangle around a whole section, or you can put a generic trust line boundary in if you just want to mark a certain point as a trust boundary. And what you do when you set your threats up is that you include that trust boundary. So flow crosses a trust boundary is the condition you use, and that's where that generates look at this particular threat. So here is the stencil that's been set up. So what the putting the icons in is under this Add Stencil section. So I've put in an application integration stencil for a section. You do have to set these behaviour and shape drop-downs when you're adding a new one, otherwise it won't work. And you'll get messages down here telling you if the template doesn't like something. It'll tell you if there's threats that don't have something in the stencil, or if a stencil isn't set up properly. And then under that, I've got the simple notification service. And so here's a property. So when users use this, they will be able to choose how is your SNS topic encrypted at rest. Not at all. I'm using AWS managed KMS, or I'm using customer managed KMS. Okay? And so you then build that into your threats for how good that is. Because if they're not using customer managed KMS, there's still some risk that someone else could pretend to be not someone who they're not. So those are the stencils, and that's the sort of way of setting it up. So here's the S3 one, and this is what I was talking to you earlier about the public access settings. So here are all the various properties I've set up so that someone can choose how have I got my access settings set. And then we go to the threats. And so they're categorised under the main headings of spoofing, tampering, repudiation, etc. And to add a new threat, you click on the category and then click the New Threat Type button, and that will put a new threat under that heading. So if I look down to, here we go, Lambda permission. So this is under the E, the very last category, elevation of privilege. So I've got a threat there. Make sure the Lambda permission doesn't contain a wildcard action. Now, I'm not going to analyse all the resource policies and IAM policies relating to an element when I do the threat modelling. So all I'm doing is making a kind of aide-memoire for the developer of, well, when you've done your Lambda function, have a look through your policies and just make sure there's no wildcard actions in there. So that's the general way that we set up the threats. It takes a bit of effort, obviously, to get those things in there and to think about how you should set up your source and your target. So here we've got the include sources Lambda function. Another thing you can use is curly bracket target.name to pick on a particular component that's being looked at, and that can help then reference that individual component in the threat. So, enough about that template. Here. So let's make a new model. So using the diagram I had earlier, so I've got a human user over here. I've got the wrong stencil. Right, there we go. Here we are. That's the thing. You see, this was using the SDL stencil. That's why I couldn't see all my elements. So always make sure you've chosen the right stencil. So let's try again. Here we go. Oh, there we go. Right, so I've got user here. Go down to my S3 bucket. Then on to SNS. Then on to SQS. Back to S3 bucket. And I mean, I would have another user at the end. I'm not going to do this just for the moment. But then we join these together. You can do requests and response, but I'm just going to join these together with a simple request at the moment. And using this pane down the bottom, you can actually name your elements more intelligently so that I could actually click on that S3 bucket there and I could give it a more meaningful name, image upload bucket or something like that, which will help it mean more when I look at the final diagram showing me the final output. I hope these are all joining together properly. There we are. So now I can do a report from this, and if I create a full report, and I haven't gone through and set all the fiddly little options because I want to leave enough time for questions and things. But if I create a report, there we are, you get this nice HTML file, which can also be quite easily chopped up and distributed to different people for different components if you needed to. But it shows you the different sections of the diagram and the various threats that could apply. So you can see there all the things I've fed into the tool are coming out. Another thing you can do is you can change into analysis view. And here you can actually see the various threats that have been found. And we've got a state box here as well. So down the very bottom, you've got a pane there where you can set the status of this and where it's at. So if developers want to come back to their diagram once their model, once they've created it, they can mark off the things they've done and easily see the things that are outstanding. Another nice thing you can do is you can export it to CSV, and sometimes you can get some duplication in there. So often what I'll do is I'll export it to CSV, do some deduplication on it, and then use that spreadsheet to record my discussions with developers of, well, what are you going to do about this? Are we going to mitigate it, or are we going to deal with it some other way? Or is the risk so low that we're accepting it? So that's really the threat modelling tool and how you can make your own templates. It's meant to be a very basic tool, so I wasn't hoping to blow anyone's minds, but I hope for those of you who've not come across it before, it might be a good place to get started. And for those of you who haven't got the money to pay for fancy cloud security posture tools and things, it might be something that you can use. Another nice thing with the diagramming is that you can actually put in other components outside of that main platform you're using. And so you could include your data warehouse, a third-party SaaS marketing platform, a third-party SaaS analytics platform, and put in all the relevant controls that you have around those. You're not restricted to just one vendor's view of security. Is anyone there? And that's it. So, any questions?
Time for questions. David, any questions?
Yeah. Sorry, it's always been got two. One is, are there any shareable AWS specific templates that you're aware of that you just go and grab? That hard work?
Yeah, I did look for this. There is one guy, I think, on BitGitHub who has made a template, but I found it was very basic. And unfortunately, even some of the other threat platforms, like there's a platform called Threat Modeler, which you can get a free account on, but you want a threat related to an S3 bucket, you've got to pay.
The second question, is around things that are non-digital. Things that might be non-digital in your threat model. How can that still cope with it? I'm thinking of things like getting some attacks in the past few weeks on IT service desk where privileged access accounts and patterns by social engineering. And that's one that's in my head. I think, well, how do I show that on that diagram?
Yeah, well, you could show the service desk as an external entity with some of the systems it links to, couldn't you? And then, yes, so you could say, source is IT service desk, and this could go wrong, and this is how we mitigate it. Sorry, I didn't repeat the question, but hopefully you heard on the microphone. Yeah, you could put anything you like in there. It's just obviously it takes time adding elements, and it's probably good to just put your effort into the resources that are going to be used the most by the people using the tool. But you could put absolutely anything in there.
Any more questions? Andrew, great welcome to you on Monday. In terms of the threat modelling, what would be a good scenario for this? So, I think, would it be a threat model for a specific process or service, or would it be useful for the whole business, with firewalls, engaged databases? What would be the best scenario or best example for that?
Yeah, I think for this, he was asking about what's the scenario, whether you use a big, broad thing of the whole business or a smaller section of it. Now, I think it is better with threat modelling to break things down enough that you can get to the point where you would implement your mitigations. Looking at the big organisation, you've got to go to a finer detail to get to that point where that mitigation actually is implemented. And so I think that's the best way for threat modelling, so you can actually tie that mitigation to that particular component.
Any more questions?
Yeah. maybe this is the answer. That's asking. But is there much of a user community developing templates?
Unfortunately, for the Microsoft tool, I don't think so. Yeah, as I say, most of the other things that I'm aware of tend to be paid for, and so you're paying for someone else to do that work. But certainly, as around threat modelling itself, then the OWASP has a good community where people discuss that, and lots of blog posts and things you can look at for threat modelling itself. But I think the best source of information about mitigating things is go back to the actual provider's website and what information they give you about how these things should be configured. Because after all, they're the ones who end up helping their customers when they've had a 0-day attack on some component. So they're going to update their guidance on configuration and provide the tools that you can actually put some settings in to stop that happening.
Are there any links to config analysis tools to link the settings back to the
I think probably with your things like your cloud posture security management things, you would get that kind of information. And I think it's something that the cloud providers are probably maturing in. Again, not everybody gets all their accounts fully integrated into the cloud platform's own security management system. There's all sorts of things there in like AWS config and inspector and everything else. But, have you got that set up and finely tuned? But that will only deal with AWS. And so by using the threat modelling tool, you can build in all those other components that you use around it as well.
Fantastic. Any other questions? We've got a little bit of time for another couple of questions if they're there.
Within the tool you showed, is there a simple way to see what coverage you have for organisations to see what areas maybe the safety design process?
No, I say it's a very simple tool. It's not even easy in this tool to see what threats you've made for a particular stencil. I end up exporting the XML and then analysing it probably in a spreadsheet. So yeah, it's a very basic tool, but that's why it's free.
Hi, is there any way that you can run the report generation templates and actually build source control security gates?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question there.
Is there any way you can run the report generation templates so you can build to source control security gates?
I'm not investigated really, and you'd obviously have to look at the terms of the software as to how much you can tamper with it. No, I don't know. Maybe you could take the HTML though, and if you can decipher what's within it, but I don't know. I'm not even sure if what's output is available as XML in a way that you could do that. There may be a possibility.
We've just got time for one last question, so go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm really interested on how you drive adoption in the business. And I'm sort of fascinated with the idea that someone might come to you and ask you to build a threat model for someone trying to buy toilet paper without using their next car. But the broader point is, do people proactively come to you and ask you for things, how you can demonstrate that?
Yeah, well, the squads I've been using this with now, when they're building things, they're fully aware threat modelling needs to be in the process, and they found it helpful. And one squad, they were very heavy on building Terraform to make things, and obviously the beauty of if you threat model your Terraform beforehand, then all the things that are built from that Terraform are going to be good. And in two different situations, one where I was noticing the previous iteration of this particular tool that was made before I joined had loads of S3 problems. I mean, it was all internal stuff, so they weren't exposed, but they were still not good. So the threat modelling exposed that, and now the new version of the tool, everything comes out of it nice and shiny, and there's loads and loads of buckets made from the tool. But another squad, they used it and they realised, the version of Terraform we're using can't cope with that setting. And so that then prompted them for an upgrade on their Terraform, which improved them in other ways, So, I've only been in the organisation 2 years, and so I haven't been using this with developers very long. But it's something we're talking to them more and more. We had our Cyber Awareness Week this week, and one of my colleagues was talking DevSecOps, and he was speaking the virtues of threat modelling and using this tool and directing people towards me. So, yeah, people, as they start to use it, they start to see how it helps them. And although we're not mature in it yet, but we're hoping that eventually you get to the point you get a good template that you can then give it to developers and let them use it on their own. But at the moment, I use it with them.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So first things first, we give a round of applause for Andrea.